The Romanian Revolution was a period of violent civil unrest in Romania in December 1989 and part of the revolutions of 1989 that occurred in several countries. The Romanian Revolution started in the city of Timișoara and soon spread throughout the country, ultimately culminating in the show trial and execution of longtime communist leader Nicolae Ceaușescu, and the end of 42 years of communist rule in Romania. It was also the last removal of a communist government in a Warsaw Pact country during the events of 1989, and the only one that violently overthrew a country's government and executed its leader. Early protests occurred in the city of Timișoara in mid-December on the part of the Hungarian minority in response to an attempt by the government to evict Hungarian Reformed Church pastor László Tőkés. In response, Romanians sought revolution and a change in government in light of similar recent events in neighboring nations. The country's ubiquitous secret police force, the Securitate, which was both one of the largest in the Eastern Bloc and for decades had been the main suppressor of popular dissension, frequently and violently quashing political disagreement, ultimately proved powerless in stopping the looming, and then highly fatal and successful, revolt. Social and economic malaise had been present in socialist Romania for quite some time, especially during the austerity years of the 1980s. The austerity measures were designed in part by Ceaușescu to repay foreign debts. Shortly after a botched public speech by Ceaușescu in Bucharest that was broadcast to millions of Romanians on state television, rank-and-file members of the military switched almost unanimously from supporting the dictator to backing the protesting population. Riots, street violence and murder in several Romanian cities over the course of roughly a week led the Romanian strongman to flee the capital city on 22 December with his wife, Deputy Prime Minister Elena Ceaușescu, evading capture by hastily departing via helicopter, effectively portrayed the couple as both fugitives and also acutely guilty of accused crimes. Captured in Targa Vista, they were tried by a drumhead military tribunal on charges of genocide, damage to the national economy and abuse of power to execute military actions against the Romanian people. They were convicted on all charges, sentenced to death, and immediately executed on Christmas Day 1989, becoming the last persons condemned to death and executed in Romania. Present-day Romania has unfolded in the shadow of the Ceaușescus along with its communist past, and the tumultuous departure from it. The National Salvation Front quickly took power after Ceaușescu was toppled, promising free and fair elections within 5 months. Elected in a landslide the following May, the National Salvation Front, reconstituted as a political party, installed a series of economic and democratic reforms, with further social policy changes being implemented by later governments. Since that point, Romania has become far more integrated with the West than its former, albeit tepid, relations with Moscow. Romania became a member of NATO and the European Union in 2004 and 2007, respectively. Democratic reforms have proven to be moderately successful. Economic reforms continue, with Romania still possessing, for example, one of the largest child poverty rates in the developed world. Background: in 1981, Ceaușescu began an austerity program designed to enable Romania to liquidate its entire national debt. To achieve this, many basic goods, including gas, heat and food, were rationed, which drastically reduced the standard of living and increased malnutrition. The infant mortality rate also grew to be the highest in Europe. The secret police had become so omnipresent that it made Romania essentially a police state. free speech was limited and opinions that did not favor the Communist Party were forbidden. The large numbers of Securitate informers made organized dissent nearly impossible. The regime deliberately played on this sense that everyone was being watched to make it easier to bend the people to the party's will. Even by Soviet bloc standards, the Securitate was exceptionally brutal. Ceaușescu created a cult of personality, with weekly shows in stadiums or on streets in different cities dedicated to him, his wife and the Communist Party. There were several megalomaniac projects, such as the construction of the grandiose House of the Republic, the biggest palace in the world, the adjacent Central Civic and a never-completed museum dedicated to communism and Ceaușescu. Today the Casa Radio. These and similar projects drained the country's finances and aggravated the already dire economic situation. Thousands of Bucharest residents were evicted from their homes, which were subsequently demolished to make room for the huge structures. Unlike the other Warsaw Pact leaders, Ceaușescu had not been slavishly pro-Soviet but rather had pursued an independent foreign policy. Romanian forces did not join its Warsaw Pact allies in putting an end to the Prague Spring, an invasion Ceaușescu openly denounced while Romanian athletes competed at the Soviet-boycotted 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. Conversely, while Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev spoke of reform, Ceaușescu maintained a hard political line and cult of personality. The austerity program started in 1981 and the widespread poverty it introduced made the communist regime very unpopular. The austerity programs were met with little resistance among Romanians and there were only a few strikes and labor disputes, of which the Duvalier miners' strike of 1977 and the Brasov rebellion of November 1987 at the truck manufacturer Stiegl Razu were the most notable. In March 1989, several leading activists of the Romanian Communist Party criticized Ceaușescu's economic policies in a letter, but shortly thereafter he achieved a significant political victory. Romania paid off its external debt of about $11 billion several months before the time that even the Romanian dictator expected. However, in the months following the announcement, austerity and a shortage of goods remained the same as before. It initially appeared that Ceaușescu would weather the wave of revolution sweeping across Eastern Europe. He was formally re-elected for another 5-year term as General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party on the 24th of November at the party's 14th Congress. On the same day, Ceaușescu's counterpart in Czechoslovakia, Miloš Jakeš, resigned along with the entire communist leadership, effectively ending communist rule in Czechoslovakia. On the 11th of November 1989, before the party Congress, on Bucharest's Brezoanu Street and Kogălniceanu Boulevard, students from Cluj-Napoca and Bucharest demonstrated with placards saying, "We want reforms against Ceaușescu government." The students, including Minea Paraschivescu, Gratian Vulp and the economist Dan Capriuș from Cluj, were detained and investigated by the Securitate at the Rahova Penitentiary on suspicion of propaganda against the Socialist Society. They were released on the 22nd of December 1989 at 1400. There were other letters and attempts to draw attention to the economic, cultural and spiritual oppression of Romanians, but they served only to intensify the activity of the police and Securitate. Another factor in the revolution was the Decrete policy, a policy banning contraception and abortion. This policy, which began in 1967, resulted in a baby boom, but also resulted in high rates of poverty and child mortality. By 1989 these children had had all reached adulthood, and many of them were among the students who started the revolution that overthrew Ceaușescu. Timișoara uprising. On 16 December 1989, the Hungarian minority in Timișoara held a public protest in response to an attempt by the government to evict Hungarian Reformed Church pastor László Tőkés. In July of that year, Tőkés had criticized the regime's systematization policy in an interview with Hungarian television, and complained that Romanians did not even know the human rights. As Tőkés described it later, the interview, which had been seen in the border areas and was then spread all over Romania, had a shock effect upon the Romanians, the Securitate as well on the people of Romania. It had an unexpected effect upon the public atmosphere in Romania. The government then alleged that Tőkés was inciting ethnic hatred. At the behest of the government, his bishop removed him from his post, thereby depriving him of the right to use the apartment to which he was entitled as a pastor, and assigned him to be a pastor in the countryside. For some time his parishioners gathered around his home to protect him from harassment and eviction. Many passers-by spontaneously joined in. As it became clear that the crowd would not disperse, the mayor, Petromou, made remarks suggesting that he had overturned the decision to evict Tőkés. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown impatient and, when Mo declined to confirm his statement against the planned eviction in writing, the crowd started to chant anti-communist slogans. Subsequently, police and Securitate forces showed up at the scene. By 1930 the protest had spread and the original cause became largely irrelevant. Some of the protesters attempted to burn down the building that housed the district committee of the Romanian Communist Party. The Securitate responded with tear gas and water jets while police beat up rioters and arrested many of them. Around 2100 the rioters withdrew. They regrouped eventually around the Romanian Orthodox Cathedral and started a protest march around the city, but again they were confronted by the security forces. Crackdown riots and protests resumed the following day, the 17th of December. The rioters broke into the district committee building and threw party documents, propaganda brochures, Ceaușescu's writings and other symbols of communist power out of the windows. The military were sent in to control the riots because the situation was too large for the Securitate and conventional police to handle. The significance of the army presence in the streets was an ominous one. It meant that they had received their orders from the highest level of the command chain, presumably from Ceaușescu himself. The army failed to establish order, and chaos ensued, including gunfire, fights, casualties and burned cars. Transportor amphibious blinded armored personnel carriers and tanks were called in. After 2000, from Piața Libertății to the Opera there was wild shooting, including the area of Despal Bridge, Calea Lipove and Calea Girocului. Tanks, trucks and tabs blocked the accesses into the city while helicopters hovered overhead. After midnight the protests calmed down. Ion Coman, Ilimate and Stefan Gusa inspected the city. Some areas looked like the aftermath of a war, destruction, rubble and blood. On the morning of the 18th of December the center was being guarded by soldiers and Securitate agents in plain clothes. Memo ordered a party gathering to take place at the university, with the purpose of condemning the vandalism of the previous days. He also declared martial law, prohibiting people from going about in groups of larger than two. Defying the curfew, a group of 30 young men headed for the Orthodox Cathedral, where they stopped and waved a Romanian flag from which they had removed the Romanian Communist coat of arms. Expecting that they would be fired upon, they started to sing Deșteptăte Romain, an earlier national song that had been banned since 1947. They were, indeed, fired upon, some died and others were seriously injured, while the lucky ones were able to escape. On the 19th of December, Radu Balin and Stefan Gusa visited workers in the city's factories but failed to get them to resume work. On the 20th of December, massive columns of workers entered the city. About 100,000 protesters occupied Piața Opera and chanted anti-government slogans. Noi suntem poporul, armata ECU noi, New Virginia fi frica, Ceaușescu pica. Quote. Meanwhile, Emil Bobu and Prime Minister Constantin Dascălescu were sent by Elena Ceaușescu to solve the situation. They met with a delegation of the protesters and agreed to free the majority of the arrested protesters. However, they refused to comply with the protesters' main demand and the situation remained essentially unchanged. The next day, trains loaded with workers from factories in Oltenia arrived in Timișoara. The regime was attempting to use them to repress the mass protests, but after a brief encounter they ended up joining the protests. One worker explained, "Yesterday our factory boss and a party official rounded us up in the yard, handed us wooden clubs and told us that Hungarians and hooligans were devastating Timișoara and that it is our duty to go there and help crush the riots." But I realized that wasn't the truth. On the 18th of December, Ceaușescu had departed for a visit to Iran, leaving the duty of crushing the Timișoara revolt to his subordinates and his wife. Upon his return on the evening of the 20th of December, the situation became even more tense, and he gave a televised speech from the TV studio inside the Central Committee building in which he spoke about the events at Timișoara in terms of an interference of foreign forces in Romania's internal affairs, and an external aggression on Romania's sovereignty. The country, which had no information about the Timișoara events from the national media, heard about the Timișoara revolt from Western radio stations like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, and by word of mouth. A mass meeting was staged for the next day, the 21st of December, which, according to the official media, was presented as a spontaneous movement of support for Ceaușescu, emulating the 1968 meeting in which Ceaușescu had spoken against the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact forces. Revolution spreads. Ceaușescu's speech on the morning of the 21st of December. Ceaușescu addressed an assembly of approximately 100,000 people to condemn the uprising in Timișoara. Party officials took great pains to make it appear that Ceaușescu was still immensely popular. Several busloads of workers, under threat of being fired, arrived in Bucharest's Piața Palatului and were given red flags, banners and large pictures of Ceaușescu. They were augmented by bystanders who were rounded up on Calea Victoria. In a speech laden with pro-socialist and Communist Party rhetoric, Ceaușescu delivered a litany of the achievements of the socialist revolution and Romanian multilaterally developed socialist society. He blamed the Timișoara uprising on fascist agitators. However, Ceaușescu was out of touch with his people and completely misread the crowd's mood. The people remained unresponsive, and only the front rows supported Ceaușescu with cheers and applause. About 2 minutes into the speech, some in the crowd actually began to jeer, boo, whistle and yell insults at him, a reaction unthinkable for most of his rule. Workers from a Bucharest power plant started chanting Timișoara, Timișoara, which was soon picked up by others in the crowd. In response, Ceaușescu raised his right hand in hopes of silencing the crowd. His stunned expression remains one of the defining moments of the end of communism in Eastern Europe. He then tried to placate the crowd by offering to raise workers' salaries by 100 lei per month and student scholarships from 100 to 110 lei, while continuing to praise the achievements of the socialist revolution. However, a revolution was brewing right in front of his eyes. As Ceaușescu was addressing the crowd from the balcony of the Central Committee building, sudden movement came from the outskirts of the massed assembly, as did the sound of fireworks, bombs or guns, which together caused the assembly to break into chaos. Initially frightened, the crowds tried to disperse. Bullhorns then began to spread the news that the Securitate was firing on the crowd and that a revolution was unfolding. This persuaded people in the assembly to join in. The rally turned into a protest demonstration. The entire speech was being broadcast live around Romania, and it is estimated that perhaps 76% of the nation was watching. Censors attempted to cut the live video feed and replace it with communist propaganda songs and video praising the Ceaușescu regime. But parts of the riots had already been broadcast, and most of the Romanian people realized that something unusual was in progress. Ceaușescu and his wife, as well as other officials and CPEX members, panicked. Ceaușescu's bodyguard hustled him back inside the building. The jeers and whistles soon erupted into a riot. The crowd took to the streets, placing the capital, like Timișoara, in turmoil. Members of the crowd spontaneously began shouting anti-Ceaușescu slogans, which spread and became chants: Jos dictatorul, Moat criminalului, Noi suntem poporul, Jos EU dictatorul, Ceaușescu siniesti, criminal din scornăsesti. Protesters eventually flooded the downtown area, from Piața Cogălnișanu to Piața Unirii, Piața Rossetti and Piața Romana. In one notable scene from the event, a young man waved a tricolor with the communist coat of arms torn out of its center while perched on the statue of Mihai Viteazul on Boulevard Mihail Cogălnișanu in the University Square. Many others began to emulate the young protester, and the waving and displaying of the Romanian flag with the communist insignia cut out quickly became widespread. Street confrontations. As the hours passed, many more people took to the streets. Later, observers claimed that even at this point, had Ceaușescu been willing to talk, he might have been able to salvage something. Instead, he decided on force. Soon the protesters, unarmed and unorganized, were confronted by soldiers, tanks, APCs, USLA troops and armed plainclothes Securitate officers. The crowd was soon being shot at from various buildings, side streets and tanks. There were many casualties, including deaths, as victims were shot, clubbed to death, stabbed and crushed by armored vehicles. One APC drove into the crowd around the Intercontinental Hotel, crushing people. A French journalist, Jean-Louis Calderon, was killed. A street near University Square was later named after him, as well as a high school in Timișoara. Belgian journalist Danny Huet was shot and killed on 23 of the 24th of December 1989 by a sniper who thought that Huet was loyal to Nicolae Ceaușescu. Firefighters hit the demonstrators with powerful water jets, and the police continued to beat and arrest people. Protesters managed to build a defensible barricade in front of the Dun area restaurant, which stood until after midnight, but was finally torn apart by government forces. Intense shooting continued until after 3 o'clock, by which time the survivors had fled the streets. Records of the fighting that day include footage shot from helicopters that were sent to raid the area and record evidence for eventual reprisals, as well as by tourists in the high tower of the centrally located Intercontinental Hotel, next to the National Theatre and across the street from the university. It is likely that in the early hours of the 22nd of December the Ceaușescus made the second mistake. Instead of fleeing the city under cover of night, they decided to wait until morning to leave. Ceaușescu must have thought that his desperate attempts to crush the protests had succeeded, because he apparently called another meeting for the next morning. However, before 7 o'clock, his wife Elena received the news that large columns of workers from many industrial platforms were heading towards downtown Bucharest to join the protests. The police barricades that were meant to block access to Piața Universității and Palace Square proved useless. By 9:30, University Square was jammed with protesters. Security forces re-entered the area only to join with the protesters. By 10 o'clock, as the radio broadcast was announcing the introduction of martial law and a ban on groups larger than 5 persons, hundreds of thousands of people were gathering for the first time, spontaneously, in central Bucharest. Ceaușescu attempted to address the crowd from the balcony of the Central Committee of the Communist Party building, but his attempt was met with a wave of disapproval and anger. Helicopters spread manifestos instructing people not to fall victim to the latest diversion attempts, but to go home instead and enjoy the Christmas feast. This order, which drew unfavorable comparisons to Marie Antoinette's haughty "let them eat cake," further infuriated the people who did read the manifestos. Many at the time had trouble procuring such basic foodstuffs as cooking oil.